Hello and welcome to another set of notes in our unit on the abnormal and treatment of abnormal psychology. We are rolling right along here and going to talk about both personality disorders and dissociative disorders. So as you can see from our learning targets today, we're going to talk about dissociative disorders. It's important for you to know that these two categories are in fact different categories. Personality disorders over here, which there are a lot of them, but the dissociative disorders over here is a whole different category in the DSM-5. So we're going to talk about some dissociative disorders first. Important for you to know, of course, what it means to disassociate. Think of disassociation as if you were kind of daydreaming or getting lost in the moment, right? Being in the flow. While working on a project, sometimes you feel that flow, right? That they talked about in our last unit. Okay, these are kind of examples of anybody and everybody that can kind of disassociate, almost as if you're breaking from a critical part of your personality, like your memory or your consciousness or your identity, that are normally integrated together, and you kind of pull back away and look in as if you're a fly on the wall. Okay, normally they work together, so temporary dissociative states are common for us. Okay, again, don't just think it's only for disordered behavior. Some examples of what we're talking about here are common, right? Like when you're en route to school or something like that. Doing an activity that you kind of are an autopilot, right? You frequently do it and you realize that you're not even thinking about what you're doing as you're doing it, and you can't even recall going through a particular intersection, say. You haven't even seen a stop sign or a red light for miles, right? You no longer remember the road trip because you don't even remember the last few miles. You've been so up in your head not thinking about the actual driving, and I guess you could say, right, that biggest disorder that we're going to talk about in this category is called dissociative identity disorder. This is previously known as, or you may have heard it as, MPD, or multiple personality disorder. So recalling what we just talked about with the meaning of disassociating, breaking away or separating a part of our personality, right? Here again, it's not a personality disorder though. It's called dissociative disorder because it is a break in personality. So it's a condition in which a person appears to be having two or more distinct and different personalities, each of whom can speak, act, and write in different ways. So we have different identities, actual different identities, seeming to have their own memories, their own wishes, their own impulses, and often the impulses of one identity conflict with the other identity. Really interesting. So problems occur because there's only one body available for each personality, right? So the different personalities have to force the other personalities to take turns because there can be such strong variations in personalities, right? A person's behavior, when looked at overall, can appear very inconsistent. So when you're on the outside looking at a person, right, at somebody that has dissociative identity disorder, or DID, you have seen these huge fluctuations in behavior, radically different, right? Erratic behavior, I guess you could say. So again, those huge fluctuations in personality is like one of the characteristics, because you don't necessarily know right away that there are multiple personalities hovering in there. Herschel Walker, in the book called Breaking Free, as a former NFL running back who delves into his excruciating struggles with DID, saying that he tried to manage a dozen or more personalities throughout his lifetime. For each one of what he called aspects. One where he was a loving father, one where he was a cutthroat football player, one where he is a businessman. Famous cases of DID include the 1950s Chris Sizemore. She was made into a movie called Three Faces of Eve, and the three of Chris's 22 distinct personalities were depicted in a book and a movie that were referred to by doctors as Eve. And you can kind of read about the differences in each of those personalities. The really famous case is Sybil, right? Her name was Shirley Mason, also in the early 1950s. She was a substitute teacher and a student at Columbia University, Ivy League college, right? She had long suffered from blackouts and emotional breakdowns. Like Sybil, her true identity and personality blacks out and goes unconscious while the other personalities come breaking through. And then these emotional breakdowns begin happening because all of the breaks and the blackouts, but also because of the huge fluctuations in the behavior and the emotions that come along with each of them, right? So she entered into psychotherapy with Dr. Cornelia P. Wilbur, a Freudian psychiatrist. And so Mason later moved to Lexington, Kentucky, where she taught art classes and ran an art gallery out of her home for many years. And then this just gives you a quick rundown of the many different personalities of Sybil. One is even a baby, right? Imagine having your baby self living inside of you and coming out and wanting to act out as him or herself. Okay, there are even some male personalities in there. There are no bounds to the variations of the personalities. In the development of DID, how can someone have this though, right? There are different perspectives who have different takes on this. Psychoanalytical perspective say that there's a massive repression, remember those defense mechanisms, a massive repression of unwanted impulses or memories, and then the person creates a whole new person to act out otherwise unacceptable impulses or recalls, otherwise unbearable memories. Okay, so this is just the idea that the true identity can't handle the really traumatic stuff. The true identity can't handle what's happening or what it is that they're remembering. So this other personality comes rushing through that she has created to allow her or him, in some cases, to deal with that trauma. Okay, a behaviorist psychologist would say that everybody is capable of acting in different ways and in different situations. So this disorder is just some kind of extreme variation of acting so differently that you feel like an entire different person is there. And therefore, when you're in a situation, you naturally, through just conditioning, right, pull out these associations, right? You just bring out this whole new personality that allows a person to kind of escape the stressful situations that they've been dealing with. Okay, there's actually been some evaluating of the true causes of DID, and it has been difficult due to the rarity of the disorder. However, most clinicians believe that the root cause of the disorder is some sort of childhood trauma or some kind of childhood abuse during a person's younger years, right? Maybe the child was separating themselves from the abuse as the trauma was occurring as a way to, quote, deal with the situation, yet remove oneself from it. So they continue to keep doing that and doing that throughout the rest of their lives in some variation, and because it's just how they know how to deal with the stress and the trauma of what they were suffering. There are some psychiatrists that don't even believe in DID as being an actual disorder. They believe the individual may be a con artist or role-playing to ease certain anxieties in his or her life. So we're going to shift now and go and talk about personality disorders. Really important to have an understanding of an overarching well that makes what a personality disorder is. Okay, it's a long-standing and inflexible personality trait, okay? Long-standing, and it's an inflexible personality traits, right? Part of who the person is, which doesn't make it less of a mental disorder. It's just very much about who they are. Part that impairs their social functioning. Okay, there are 3 clusters. Cluster A exhibits odd or eccentric behavior. Cluster B exhibits dramatic and emotional traits. And Cluster C exhibits anxious or fearful behaviors. Okay, so they often seek treatment as an insistence of others, whether it's court, under pressure from family members or from friends. The individual is not usually distressed by his or her condition when it comes to personality disorders, right? They're not distressed by it because it's just who they are, right? But it does cause some dysfunction in their life, okay? So cluster A, okay, there's 3 types underneath cluster A. So paranoid is characterized by paranoia with a pervasive, meaning you can't get rid of it, long-standing suspiciousness and generalized mistrust of others, right? And so they're always kind of looking over their shoulder and accusing other people of kind of having it out for them. Schizoid is a pattern of an indifference to social relationships with limited range of emotional expression and experience. They don't really fluctuate in their emotions at all. And really, they struggle because it's not any big deal to them. They just don't have social relationships. It manifests itself by early adulthood through social and emotional detachments, right? That prevents people from having closer relationship. Whereas schizotypal, really similar name there, but they're a very different pattern of social and interpersonal difficulties. Okay, schizotypal includes a sense of discomfort with close relationships, where schizoid is indifferent, schizotypal is discomfort. Okay, so you're not comfortable with the relationships, right? Those relationships, the eccentric behavior and unusual thoughts and perceptions of reality and what others think about them. And the patient usually experiences some kind of distorted thinking, right? They behave strangely and they avoid intimacy. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about paranoid personality disorder. They display, again, pervasive distrust and suspiciousness. And some common beliefs include that others are exploiting or deceiving them. Friends and associates are untrustworthy. All right, so there's a lot of accusations, right? Information confided to others will be used maliciously. They confide in someone else or tell them a secret or something personal about themselves. They don't want to tell other people because they'll accuse them of, you're going to come back and use that against me. Right? There's a hidden meaning and remarks. There are events others perceive as benign. It had to mean something else, right? More sinister, but to the extreme. And then oftentimes the spouse or the partner is unfaithful. Again, it's lots of accusations. They're called cluster B, including 4. We're going to quickly run through 3 here. First, there's borderline. Okay, this is marked by ongoing patterns, so varying moods, self-image, and behavior. So it's really erratic behavior. These symptoms often result in impulsive action, and then problems in relationships, right? And then history is characterized by a pattern of excessive attention-seeking emotion. This one usually begins in early adulthood also, including inappropriately seductive behavior. So they're a little promiscuous. They act out sexually. They have an excessive need for approval and attention and affection, which oftentimes they find using their seductive behavior. Then there's this narcissistic, which I'm sure you've heard about. This is when you have a long-term pattern of abnormal behavior, which is characterized by exaggerated feelings of self-importance, right? An excessive need of admiration and a lack of empathy. Right? How I'm so great. I'm feeling awful. What's going on in my life? What am I going through? Right? That's so much more important to a narcissist than anything else. Again, we can be really accusatory in all 3 of these. We might read into them and be like, wow, I don't really want to deal with that type of person. And I wouldn't be able to stand a person like that if I were in a relationship, right? You're not wrong, because people who have these personality disorders, they are very hard to love. They're hard to deal with, but we don't want to be judgy because it's a disordered behavior. And so we should be compassionate and think about trying to help them and getting them to seek treatment and getting them to be a more balanced person and teach them how to live a less dysfunctional life. Okay, borderline personality disorder, a little bit more of a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships here. Okay, people with this have a self-perception that is unstable and intense. Their self-perception and their moods and impulse control is markedly impaired. This is why we have this diagnostic criteria of at least having to have 5 of the following features for this particular diagnosis. Okay, you see that they act impulsively. They have an affective instability, which is emotional instability, oftentimes becoming or abusing substances. They're sexually promiscuous, inappropriate, and intense anger. So a lot of times you see drug abuse with these folks as well. Okay, antisocial personality is the fourth one. This is probably the most well-known personality disorder, and one that you should really make sure that you know about, understanding the clinical features of what we call APD. Antisocial personality disorder, they must include 3 of the following traits. First, a lack of conforming to the law, as evidenced by repeatedly committing crimes. When you hear the word antisocial, I don't want you to think of it like the schizotypal personality disorder. I want you to think not, I don't want to be social with anyone. I want you to think they shouldn't be social, okay? You should keep away from these people, right? Because they're criminals. So the opposite of antisocial, the meaning of antisocial, right? This will be helpful when we talk about it in social psychology. Pro-social behavior is altruism. Something is altruistic when it is beneficial to somebody else. You're being helpful, right? It's having a positive effect on society. Antisocial is being the opposite. That would be having a negative effect or impact on society. And that is it. It's drawing away from someone, having a negative effect on social life of others or yourself. There's no lack of conforming to the laws. There's repeated deception or deceitfulness, right? They lie in their relationships. They use others. They make up names. They con others for profit. They fail to think or plan ahead. There's a lot of impulsivity, right? A tendency towards anger and aggression, as shown by repeatedly assaulting other people, getting into frequent physical fights and arguments, a disregard for personal safety or the safety of others. You have to be 18 to be diagnosed with APD. The individual must have shown symptoms, though, of the diagnosis since they turned 15 years old. And usually the individual has been previously diagnosed in childhood with what we call conduct disorder. We're going to talk more about that as well. And another one here in a sec. It more often occurs in males, and sometimes you'll see the term sociopath or psychopath in relation to antisocial personality disorder. So you should make a note that these people are incredibly, or can be incredibly, charming. They're very deceptive with their intentions and can very easily fool you, right? They effectively fool people because lure them in so that they can do more damage. They want to win you over so that they can then crush you. There's some controversy over what causes this, and some studies suggest there's a genetic component, a genetic predisposition. So possibly in the form of chronic under arousal of both the autonomic and the central nervous system, so that leads to abnormally low anxiousness, leaving them less sensitive to punishment. Other research link it to underdeveloped amygdala. Right? And then some others believe in that it's mostly environmental factors, like coming from a broken home, rejected by their parents, poor discipline, lack of good parental models, lack of attachment, the early caregivers were not present, those sorts of things. In the PET scans of 41 murderers, they realized that there was reduced activity in the frontal lobe. A follow-up study report with repeat offenders had 11% less frontal lobe activity compared to normal brains, which you can see in the scans on the screen. We're going to talk more about these two that I've listed in your notes. One is neurodevelopmental disorders, but you should note that because these occur in children, they are not and cannot be considered personality disorders. These are called neurodevelopmental disorders, and again, we'll talk about them. Okay, the next is conduct disorder. Conduct disorder can be defined as repetitive and persistent patterns of behavior in which the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate norms are violated. Essentially, you're being antisocial, but you're young, right? The antisocial behaviors in a child is called oppositional defiant disorder. It's not quite as intense or as bad as conduct disorder, but it's a frequent and persistent pattern of anger, irritability, arguing back, defiance, vindictiveness towards your parents, or any other authority figure. Whereas oppositional defiant disorder is more about stable mood and snapping and acting out. Conduct disorder is just a little more intense of what bad things they are doing, whereas oppositional defiant disorder is more about the mood. Finally, we have cluster C. These are pretty self-explanatory, but you should make sure that you've got the proper terms here. Avoidant, meaning feelings of extreme social inhibition, right? Like not being able to kind of socially interact. You have some inadequacy where you feel completely awkward when you're around people or in social situations. Okay, sensitivity to negative criticism, an inability to be constructively criticized, and having an issue with rejection, right? It causes significant problems, and the ability to maintain those day-to-day relationships. Being dependent, right? Meaning characterized by the inability to be alone. Developing symptoms of anxiety, because cluster C is about those emotional and anxious feelings. When they're not around other people, they need constant reassurance from other people just to function on a daily basis. They're very needy. Now, we've talked about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, but what about OCPD, which is obsessive compulsive personality disorder? This is characterized by a preoccupation with, so that's the difference here, right? It's not the intrusive thoughts followed by a compulsion. It's a preoccupation that it's part of who they are. And they think a lot about things like tidiness and order, perfectionism, mental and interpersonal control at the expense of flexibility, openness, and the efficiency, right? They are not flexible at all. Very preoccupied with everything being orderly and the way they want it. Okay, I hope you found these helpful, and although there's a lot of intense information here and a lot of information, make sure you rewind, pause, go back, memorize, listen again. If you missed anything, go ahead and how other teachers are talking about these things. That's all for tonight. Bye now.